Hi, my name is Jared, and this is Horror Obsession. Today, I want to talk about a series of relatively shorter videos I am going to be doing with the specific intent to discuss the slasher genre, called Slasher School. It is no secret the slasher genre is my favorite subgenre of horror, as any of you who have followed the channel can attest to. The purpose of this series of videos will be to educate audiences on the tropes and themes of slasher films, and maybe even convince my family I'm not a psychopath reveling in teenage murder, though I think that ship has sailed.
If they'd watch Prom Night, they'd save time. There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect.
I want to start by asking a simple but extremely complex question. What is a slasher movie? I think most people have some blueprint in their head which probably follows the pattern of Halloween pretty closely. A crazed killer stalks and kills a group of friends one by one until there is a sole survivor, generally a girl, who then fights back and defeats the killer, with or without an end scene showing the horror has not been defeated and leaving the door open for a sequel. J.T. Heslop described the slasher genre as, quote, trashy, formulaic, and in the case of its central antagonist, prone to idiotic pop psychology. Example, Mommy didn't love me enough. Roger Ebert took a similar approach, describing the slasher genre as simply, quote, dead teenager movies, end quote.
But actually, this movie is just more leftover recycled garbage from the last 4 times around. It uses the same basic old formula, the formula I call the dead teenager formula, you know, where there are a lot of living teenagers at the beginning of the movie, and by the end of the movie, all of the teenagers are dead. They are apparently all being killed by Jason, the guy in the hockey mask.
Regardless of critical opinion, these movies are extremely popular with audiences and probably peaked in 1983 when the book Crystal Lake Memories estimated that a staggering 60% of all box office revenue came from slasher films. So who is right? The critics who see nothing but mindless teenage murder, or the audiences flocking to these movies in droves? Like most definitions, an examination of edge cases can be an interesting way of fleshing out the genre and figuring out where the line is drawn, or at least come to a greater understanding of what the genre means. I want to break down the general elements of a slasher film in this video, and then take a more in-depth look at specific genre tropes and themes in additional videos dedicated to each trope. I want to save the in-depth discussion of these elements for later, so instead I will just list them. The final girl, the villain, the victims, the harbinger, investigate a strange noise, the starting gun, the disappearing body, and final jump scare. I want to take a look at some movies which are absolutely 100% considered slashers, and then some which are a bit more controversial, as analyzing why these movies aren't generally considered slashers can illuminate critical elements of slasher movies. The first movie I want to look at is Halloween, 1978. While other movies such as Psycho, 1960, or Black Christmas, 1974, are often considered the first slasher films, Halloween is definitely the first movie which incorporated all the modern tropes. Psycho has the killer with some kind of psychopathology, but only 2 characters die, including the leading lady who would probably be the final girl in a more traditional slasher. Black Christmas has long POV shots of the killer's perspective, coupled with the now cliche heavy breathing sounds, and much more closely matches modern audiences' conceptualization of a slasher film. Halloween checks all the boxes, however, and therefore makes a great example for someone learning the genre. Final girl? Check. Laurie Strode. She is young, virginal, doesn't drink or do drugs like her sinful friends, and the only character with a active investigative gaze, a term used to describe the character seeking out and discovering information to unravel the story, which I will talk about more in the Final Girl and Starting Gun videos. The villain, Michael, has all the standard characteristics of a slasher villain. He uses a butcher knife, he wears a mask, he disappears bodies, he is seemingly invincible, and the movie ends with a re-establish the horror moment with Michael somehow surviving the gunshots and the fall off a second-story balcony. The only trope which doesn't exactly match is the harbinger trope, where a character tells the kids they're going to die.
Okay, and then over...
I told the others. They didn't believe me. You're all doomed. You're all doomed.
However, a closer look will show that Dr. Loomis is the Harbinger in this movie. In the amazing docudrama meta-horror movie Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, they call this version of the Harbinger an Ahab, because he is obsessed with catching the killer in the same way Ahab was obsessed with catching Moby Dick, and Deshaun Watson is obsessed with sexually assaulting masseuses. Finally, the intended purpose of Halloween is to scare the audience, a core tenet of every horror movie, not just slashers. If Halloween is the quintessential slasher movie, what are some movies which check most, but maybe not all of the boxes? A movie like Jaws, I think, is a great example of this. Final Girl? Well, Brody is not a girl, obviously, but he is left alone to defeat the shark at the end of the movie, so I think it counts. Brody additionally acts as his own Ahab, warning the townsfolk against the danger but having no one listen. The victims are a bit non-traditional since it isn't a group of young attractive people getting killed one by one, even though the first kill starts that way. There is the kid, there's the ship guy, and of course Quint, the shark hunter, none of which really matches the standard slasher victim. The starting gun is when the town believes there's a shark in the water, so that matches, but where this movie falls apart for being a slasher, in my opinion, is in the villain itself, the shark. In a traditional slasher film, the killer is a masked human with an unusual weapon such as a knife, pickaxe, or fishing hook, and generally does not use a gun. This brings me along to my next movie, the first Terminator. Everything about this movie fits the slasher concept, with the unstoppable killer murdering people one by one in an attempt to get to the final girl. The victims include Sarah's friends, but also an entire police station. However, I don't think upping the ante in this way is enough to make Terminator not a slasher. The Harbinger is of course Kyle Reese, who shows up to give his awesome speech.
That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
Which then serves as the starting gun. There is no disappearing body trope here, however, and once again this movie is a non-traditional slasher, mostly due to the villain. The Terminator meets a lot of the criteria, being essentially impervious to bullets and being able to show up somewhat magically wherever Sarah is. The Terminator uses a gun, however, and in a slasher film the villain generally slashes people, and someone using a gun doesn't really count. I think both Jaws and Terminator, and another one of my all-time favorites, Alien, are all very close to a slasher film, but more accurately fall under the monster subgenre of horror, which basically shares every element of a slasher with the exception of the killer being, well, a monster. Now that we have looked at two monster movies which are mostly slashers but are missing a few key elements, let's take a look at two genres which are often very similar to slashers and try to figure out what makes slashers unique. The thriller genre is one which shares a lot of common attributes to a horror film but focuses more on the investigative aspect rather than the victims. For example, I have heard film scholars say the difference between a thriller and a horror is the presence of a mystery to unravel, but I suspect these scholars haven't seen very many horror movies, something I'm disturbingly qualified to say.
If they'd watch Prom Night, they'd save time. There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect.
Take Scream, for example. There is a mass killer who kills with a knife and whittles down Sydney's group of friends, and I don't think many would argue this is a horror movie, especially since it self-identifies as such in the script.
You don't... Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
However, there is also a murder mystery present, and this race to discover the killer is the focus of not just the first movie, but all of the sequels as well. So what separates Scream from something like Seven, a movie most people would likely not describe as a horror movie? In Scream, the focus is on the victims, as we learn about Sidney Prescott and her friends, whereas with Seven we focus on the investigation of Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, and only learn about the victims after they've been subjected to their deadly sin. Thinking about these specific movies, it becomes clear one core element of a slasher film is the focus on the victims, not the investigation, if there is an investigation. This rule applies quite broadly, as I think most people would agree Urban Legend is a horror movie, but Zodiac is not, even though Zodiac definitely has horror elements, and the most horror seen in the movie comes when Fincher decides to focus on the victims. Another similar genre which I want to explore is that of torture porn. This is a term which has been around for a while, and I think most people would associate the term with movies like Hostel and the Saw franchise. So what separates these movies from slashers? There is a cast of young victims, and they get killed one by one until there is one or maybe two of them left to fight the villains. Both subgenres focus on gratuitous violence, though I think quite obviously torture porn movies focus on it even more than slashers and really turn it up to 11. The main difference, I think, is in the villains and in the means of killing. Jigsaw is presented as the clown-faced thing in the first movie, but obviously that ends up being a red herring. He isn't a mass killer like a traditional slasher, and there's definitely a bit of sympathy with the devil with his character as he is trying to teach his victims a lesson about life in a very Tyler Durden-esque way.
Raymond, you're going to die. Tomorrow will be the most beautiful day of Raymond Castle's life. His breakfast will taste better than any meal you and I have ever tasted.
While other slasher franchises such as Nightmare on Elm Street or Chucky transition to making the killer the protagonist for later movies, the traditional classic version has the killer as the antagonist and invokes sympathy strictly for the victim and primarily the final girl. The second difference I wanted to talk about is the means of killing. Franchises such as Friday the 13th are notorious for creative kills, with all kinds of interesting and fun ways they off their cast. The quality of the kills in slashers is something I talk about a lot in my reviews, because once you've seen a lot of slashers, it becomes almost impossible to not compare the creativity of the kills to one another. The kills are generally set up with a long, drawn-out scene with the victim searching through a room or the infamous investigate a strange noise trope. Torture porn is a bit different in the sense the scene is not trying to create suspense or tension, but rather is showing explicit and excessive violence and gore specifically in the place of tension. This is what sours people on the genre, I think, including myself, since without the build-up and quiet moments in between to rest, it just feels like a roller coaster that only goes down and down and down and down some more until you throw up. Of course, some movies, like the Friday the 13th remake, forego the creation of suspense and tension because they are shittily directed, but I digress. Overall, slashers are an iconic subgenre of horror which have so epitomized the genre, I think many people think specifically of slashers when thinking of the horror genre in general. I want to take a look at the 8 tropes listed earlier, starting with the smaller, less genre-defining tropes such as the starting gun and disappearing body, and building up to the final girl and the villain. The plan is to release these videos once every week or two, but if I fall behind, don't worry. I'm probably just out investigating a strange noise, or warning a group of kids they're gonna die, or moving bodies of dead teenagers around.